Dear guests, next will be the roundtable named Global Trade to Development for All Trade Wars. The pioneer countries of the global economic system have made a serious effort towards the liberalization of international trade from the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade to the World Trade Organization. However, since the global financial crisis 2008, the escalating search for protectionism in the world economy has gained a different dimension with the trade wars that have deepened in recent months. The deepening of the protectionist tendency and trade wars, in this respect, pose a global threat to the development for all focus of the leading countries. Moderator of the roundtable is Professor Dr. İlter Turan, member of the Honorary Board of the ICP Turkey, and panelists are Mr. Bobo Lo, author, international relations expert, Australia, Mr. Yukon Huang, author, international relations expert, USA, Mr. Mekki El-Shibli, Executive Director, MBC, Sudan.
Efendim müsaadenizle bundan sonrasını panelistlerimizin hepsi İngilizce konuşacakları için İngilizceye de geçeceğim ben de o şekilde devam edeceğiz. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to have a very distinguished panel this morning to discuss the implications of trade wars on the global economic system, on sustainable economic development, on global security, its influence on the global markets, global financial systems. I could go on listing the sort of implications, the implications of trade wars on a lot of areas. But I will refrain from commenting on those myself. I'm the least of the experts in this panel. We have outstanding experts who will take up these questions. Unfortunately, we do have a limitation of time, which has become even narrower by the fact that we started out a little late. So I will try to get the panel finished by about 1 o'clock. And without taking much of your time any longer, let me reintroduce the panelists that have been introduced to you. But we do have, on the one hand, Yukon Huang, who was the head of the executive director of the China desk at the World Bank, and is currently associated with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. We do have Bobo Lo, who is currently associated with the IFRI, Institut Français de Relations Internationales, and he was previously associated with other outfits, starting from Australia, then moving to Great Britain. And then, of course, we have the distinguished Professor Mekki El-Shibli, the Executive Director of MBC in the Sudan. I will ask for Yukon to sort of kick off the discussion, then we'll move to Professor El-Shibli, and we will conclude with Bobo Lo, who shall examine the security implications of trade wars. So, Yukon, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. It's a real pleasure to be here. Within the next week, President Trump will be meeting President Xi Jinping in Argentina at the G20 meetings. And one of the major topics is the U.S.-China trade war. There's a lot of concern as to whether or not they'll be able to forge an agreement. And most people think probably not. If they cannot forge an agreement, then very quickly, within early January, you're probably going to see a major trade war with global implications. That means the U.S. will follow through on some $250 billion of tariffs on China's exports. China will retaliate. Tariff rates will go up from 10 to 25%. There's a potential that this will affect tariffs on automobiles. And later, as I will show, it could lead to a decline in global production by as much as 1% over the next year or two. So this will have global implications. I'd like to summarize the US-China trade dispute with 3 words. It's basically counterproductive. It's counterproductive because everybody loses. It's unnecessary. It's unnecessary because the problem can be solved in different ways than through punitive tariffs. But this trade war is inevitable. It's inevitable because it's actually the clash between a rising power and the dominant power. And it's been building up for years. So even if President Trump disappears from the political scene 2 years from now, I think these tensions will continue. So let me start off by trying to talk about what is it we're talking about. What is this US-China trade war? Is it about trade deficits? Because that is what President Trump is focused on, the huge US trade deficits with China. But the business community is not concerned about trade deficits. It's concerned about China's so-called unfair investment practices. But the politicians, the geostrategists, the foreign policymakers, they're fixated on really about the great power battle for economic supremacy. So you have 3 issues. And if you don't understand the nature of these issues, then we will not understand the policy implications. And what I want to stress today is that our understanding of the issues is so poor, and that's part of the reasons why the policy issues are so badly formulated. And that's why I don't think this trade war can be solved. Let's look at China's trade relations with the world over the last 15, 20 years. I'm an economist, so I'd like to use figures. So this is a diagram of China's trade balances with various regions of the world. Go back 15, 20 years, and what you see is that China is not a significant trading partner with anybody. It doesn't have significant deficits or surpluses. And then starting from around 2003 and 4 and 5, after it joined WTO, it starts to generate huge trade surpluses with America. That's the top black line. And you can see that China's surpluses with the United States get bigger and bigger and bigger. It also generates a major trade surplus with the EU, and that's the blue line. And you can see that Europe is also experiencing a tremendous trade deficit with China, but it's different from America, because starting with the global financial crisis, Europe's trade deficits with China start to diminish. Then jump to the bottom red line. That's America's trade deficits with Asia. And in between, you have balances with the rest of the world, Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and those are basically cyclical. They really don't make much of a difference in terms of the overall balance. Now this pattern, this regional pattern is very different. It's also structural. It will not change. That means for the foreseeable future, China will run huge trade surpluses with America, slightly less with Europe, and deficits with East Asia. But overall, China's trade balance is coming down. In fact, by next year and the following year, China's overall trade balance will be in deficit. It will no longer be a surplus country. So one great irony is we are facing a trade war with China on the assumption that it generates huge surpluses, and this is a problem. But in fact, China very soon is beginning to generate deficits, not even surpluses. But from an American's perspective, they see China as the problem. So President Trump, when he puts these tariffs on China, he's assuming that US-China trade balances are linked. That America has huge deficits, and this is being caused by huge surpluses from China. And the irony is, US-China trade balances are not linked at all. So we're fighting a war over trade when the trade balances are not even related. So how do we show this? How do we show that China's trade surpluses do not really cause America's trade deficits? And this is the diagram that shows it. If you look at the blue line, that's America's overall trade deficits as a share of global GDP. And you can see starting from about the late 90s, America starts to generate a huge trade deficit, and that trade deficit only starts to moderate around 2004 and 5. Then if you look at the red line is China's trade surpluses as a share of GDP. The first thing you realize is that China does not even generate any significant surpluses until 2004 and 5. So the first point I want to make is that China cannot possibly be causing America's trade problems, because when America is generating huge deficits, China is not even generating any significant surpluses. In fact, their trade balances move in the opposite direction. When China starts to generate huge trade surpluses around 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, that's precisely when America's trade deficits actually get smaller. They move in the opposite direction than you would have expected. Now today, America's trade deficits are starting to get very large. But China's trade surpluses are starting to disappear. So the first point I'd like to make is we have a trade war between America and China on the assumption that their trade balances are somehow linked. But strangely enough, they're not linked at all. And the key change in the global economy is the other line, the black line. That's Europe. Europe is starting to generate huge trade surpluses. So actually, if there is a link in terms of America's trade deficits, it's really linked with Europe's trade surpluses and not with China at all. But in fact, we don't have yet what I would call a US-Europe trade war. We have a US-China trade war, but it's on false premises. Now, this is the composition of global exports of manufacturing goods. And the major goods are textiles, minerals, machinery, chemicals, transport, electronics. Electronics are the yellow line. And you can see over the last 15 years, China's surging growth of manufactured exports from very low levels to the level that now is the world's largest exporter of manufactured goods, and is largely accounted for by manufactured goods. And then if you look at other country groupings, ASEAN, relatively stable. Germany, relatively stable. Japan, sharp decline. South Korea, still rising. And then there's America, a sharp decline. And from the perspective of America, the perception is that this decline is due to manufactured electronics. So they see this as a technology war. They see this, that China is gaining comparative advantages in terms of the yellow line, technology, electronic products. But this line actually is not significant in terms of global security or power politics. What really matters actually globally in terms of security, in terms of your domination of a global power, is really exports of services. So this is the exports of services by various country groupings. And the services are computer, financial, hotels. We have restaurants, transports, wholesale, retail businesses. And here China's exports of services is increasing, but it is still very, very modest. But if you look at the very far right and look at America, what you see is America's domination of the global value of services. This is where America's power actually lies. It does not lie in manufacturing. It lies in the control and exports of services. And then if you look at the services, America's services, the composition of American services, and you look at the colors in terms of the products, the kinds of services, then you look at China, and you see something which is quite different. And the difference is financial services. That yellow, that orange-yellow line, that orange line America's domination is in global financial services, and China has nothing in there. And most other countries have very little. So this is actually America's control of the global economy. It's not through manufactured goods. It's through control of the financial system, the global financial system. And that's why America can have unilateral sanctions on Iran, on North Korea, on Cuba, and if you enter into a really fierce trade war, potentially on China. And that is the strength of the American economy. It's control of the global system. It's not actually through manufactured exports. It's through the control of the services. It's control of financial services. So here we are having a trade war. And people think it's actually about manufactured goods. And it isn't. Because the real domination of the global economy is about services. How American businesses have a very different view of what's going on in China. They see China's trade policies as being unfair. So this is a global poll of American business views of the fairness of the trade systems, and you can see that the perception is that China's trade system is unfair. So that's why you have the punitive tariffs. America's levying punitive tariffs because they see China's trade policies as being unfair. This is the consequence of the trade war if it continues. And I've grouped here into three categories: United States, China, G20 advanced economies, G20 emerging economies. And you have 3 or 4 or 5 components. The first round of China tariffs, US tariffs, tariffs on cars, and then you have what I call the confidence effect, the financial effect. If you sum it all together, if this trade war continues, what you see here is that America's economy will fall by about 0.8%. That's quite significant. But China's economy will fall by twice as much. 1.6% of its GDP will be lost. And then if you look at the advanced economies and the emerging market economies, they will also be negatively affected, but the emerging market economies will be affected more so. So this is ultimately what's going to happen if this trade war continues for many years. Let me get on to the third issue. Is this really about trade? Not really. Is it really about technology or investment practices? Probably not. Is it about a global power shift? And I think this is the problem. This is causing the tension between the countries. So here's a chart. This is a chart of the global share of these economies' share of GDP over the last 200 years. Go back to 200 years, to 1820. China accounted for 35% of global production. That's the red line. So 200 years ago, China accounted for 35% of global GDP. And look at the sharp decline over the last 200 years. By 1950, China accounted for only 3% of global production. From 35% to 3%, a dramatic decline. And then you see what's happened since 1950. A sharp increase. 1980, down to 1980. A sharp increase from about 3% to 15, 16. So if you look at 2017, 2018, there's no coincidence. It's not a coincidence that we have a US-China or global trade war, because if you look at America's share, Europe's share, China's share of global GDP today is exactly the same. So Europe and America has been declining very significantly over the last 10 years. China's been rising very quickly. Today, they're exactly the same. Now, fast forward another 10 years. 10 years from now, if China continues to grow at 6% or 5%, and Europe and America continues to grow at 2 or 3, you can see a very rapid shift in the global share of GDP. China's share of global production will be very, very large. And this is seen from a Western perspective as a threat.
You're about to complete.
Very quickly. Okay. So the second basic point is the technology wars. People see China's technology wars trying to become more innovative as a major threat to America's dominance. That's the second threat. The Belt and Road Initiative. This is seen, and you're having a session later on in there, this is seen as giving China a leverage and a presence. But the true threat that you see in Washington is a conflict between two political and economic systems. The Chinese system I describe as a Chinese dining table. It's the party, the government, enterprises, and business fused together in a Chinese dining table with one pillar and a round top, which is GDP. That's the Chinese model. Extraordinarily effective growth instrument because of its coordination. And then there's the Western dining table, the US-Europe dining table, a rectangular table with the party, the government, banks all split together. And which of these tables, or is China going to be able to move to a Western table? That's the big issue, and that's why you see this conflict between America and China. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think your presentation was particularly important to remind us that it is often better to study things before reaching judgments, because the statistics and the diagrams you showed belies the classical allegations made by Mr. Trump and his friends. And secondly, I think you also demonstrated that it might be more prudent to address these questions within the framework of international cooperation rather than unilateral action. I find it rather difficult to believe that the United States leads the way in destroying the very system it built after the Second World War, which clearly worked to its advantage. But then let us now turn to Professor Mehdi Hashimli, because he will probably give us additional broad perspective on how we should see these changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. In the opening speeches, we had a split perception about the global peace and war. And I'll try through 10 slides to help you either to associate yourself with the optimistic camp or the pessimistic camp through the dynamics of trade war. In my view, trade war has got a lot to do with youth unemployment. And I believe what's going on in America is driven to a great extent by the employment situation, especially for the youth. Let us quickly go through the scope of youth unemployment in the world. Youth are defined by the UN as those who are between the age of 15 and 24. UNESCO takes a bracket of 15 to 35. Of 70 million people on Earth, there are 5 billion aged between 5 and older. 3 billion need full employment formal jobs, where currently there are only 1.2 billion jobs. So we have a deficit of 1.8 billion jobs. And this is what the situation is all about. Youth unemployment is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, challenges of our time. Consequential instability and violence of youth unemployment can be manifested by the toxic unemployment, instability, and poverty that undermines socio-economic development. Unemployment of youth are unemployed youth are more vulnerable than others for making violence and making illicit activities. A country with more than 40% of its population aged between 15 and 29 is 2.3 times more likely to face lengthy strikes and violence. High concentration of unemployed youth led to explosive conditions resulting in political crises feared to trigger the Third World War. That was once 5-6 years ago, and that was manifested by the so-called Arab Spring, and it's still waging, still going on. That was primarily manifested or driven by unemployed youth. So this gives you a dimension as to how these problems can reach. Youth unemployment is also a main cause of emigration. Unemployed youth in the third world always seek opportunities of jobs, of course, in Europe and US. Youth immigration poses problems in the hosting countries as well as in the source countries, which involves loss of investment as well as loss of technical cadre. So both impacts are peace-threatening for both developing and for developed countries. The triggers of US Third World were also, in my view, related to jobs. The deficit of US is $300 billion with China. So US is trying to impose tariffs so that it can activate or dynamize its local industries so as to create more jobs. In response, China, EU, Canada, and many other countries were involved in a tit-for-tat protectionism. Indigenous value addition through tariffs leads to more jobs. That's the US perception. So US asked, that was only 2 days ago, asked its allies in Europe to shun Chinese Huawei, fearing cybersecurity risks relating to 5G technology and the Internet of Things. And of course, you know how Huawei is important to China. And you from now expect as how the Chinese are going to retaliate if Huawei is being jeopardized. I remember when I was a student in America, they used to say, what is good for Ford is good for America. I believe now what is good for Huawei is good for China. So I don't think Chinese would tolerate that move, which has been instigated by the Americans 2 days ago. And this would give us an idea as to how technology is reinforcing trade war. Impact of trade war in global economy, our distinguished colleague have just gone through eloquently. It has been statistically estimated that it can impact GDP and global trade by 6 and 1.5%. Through employment increase in industry, increased tariff, unemployment will rise, and industries will increase by tariff. Eventually, we'll have inflation. That will take time, and this maybe adds to the pessimistic view, is that the worst is yet to be seen, because these implications are on raw materials, and they will manifest themselves gradually in the final goods as time goes by, and things can only get worse. The result of rising employment, particularly among the youth, is also threatening peace. Will trade war spark shooting war? A question for you to answer, especially from the decisive visions which have been portrayed to us in the inaugural sessions. Protectionism threatening not only the economy, but world peace. Protectionism resurgence manifested by Brexit in Britain, patriotisme économie in France, or America First in America, is impacting or making shedding the light over what sort of problems we are facing in terms of the Chinese. Of course, they don't have a slogan, but they have practice. That also adds to these three slogans which have been put forward by the leaders. Macron said nationalism is a betrayal to patriotism. And this is very, very significant. It tells you about the potential problems which are arising between US and the EU. So ultranationalism and tariff wars, they led to World War I. Are they going to lead to World War III? We'll see. By the way, is it a coincidence? Is World War a war for jobs? World War III a war for jobs? Is it? there is a slight dyslexia here in this monitor. Lack of youth jobs is very crucial as a cause of global problems, and some people try to, or some countries try to tackle it through politics, others through, of course, military. In 30 years, probably the world will be led by the country which, or the economy which can provide jobs for its people, because it's going to be more peaceful, at least internally. Macron urged the creation, of course, as we all followed, of the European Defense Force, and that was hailed by Putin for obvious reasons. And is it a coincidence that this revival of, say, European Defense Force during or amongst or in the midst of the trade war, is it a coincidence, or has it got to do with where we are heading towards? Diffusing the trade war is hard also to give some, say, what we share together, somehow how we can go to about that. I think we have to go to the root cause, which is the youth unemployment, and try to prepare the youth for having suitable jobs. And prioritize youth unemployment cognizant agenda in the global, the cognizant employment or youth employment agenda in the global agenda, using bottom-up approach. That's I mean engaging the youth in the solutions. Adopt politics for eradication of extreme poverty and hunger. Promote gender equality and create an entrepreneurial and financial ecosystem that drives innovation amongst the youth, and improve public delivery of wage goods such as housing, infrastructure, health, education, and nutrition. That would help to stabilize the youth and assist in their contribution. Roadmap to trade war mitigation. I think we need to share, views in this sort of gathering. We need to share some views as to how we can try to be optimist in this global scene which you have just highlighted. So we have to address this. The resurgence of ultranationalism and militarism, which is really taking place, and it was about to expand in France, and there is a threat that is going to go in Italy. During the last election, there was a threat of that. So if this is not addressed, the world would face to more problems. Then hasten the bilateral negotiation of securing market and access to agreeing trade war. Because as is eloquently Dr. Abu Ghazala mentioned earlier on, that people will agree first, and it was commented that when people come to agree after war, then they would not have full mental capacity. So in order to avoid that, I think people will try to agree now, if that is possible, although the situation does not indicate that. Engage multilateral entities to involve global perspective. You have to be multilateral. These things, if left to bilateral interest, I think more problems are going to continue. Encourage regional and sub-regional interactions, and promote good economic governance and corporate governance. And thank you very much for your listening.
Well, thank you very much. In fact, you have certainly given us an opportunity to broaden the discussion. When we look at trade wars, we have a tendency to study the implications of trade wars on other aspects of interactions between countries. But in fact, I think the preceding discussion shows us that we have to look at it from two perspectives. In other words, we have to examine what it is that produces trade wars, in addition to how trade wars produce outcomes that are also problematical for the operation of the international system. And so it's a two-way process, and it needs to be addressed at both ends. I mean, just trying to fight the trade wars is not enough. You have to fight the conditions which generate the trade wars. Now, in fact, in concluding part of his remarks, Yukon referred to the idea that the game wasn't really about trade, the game was about power. And in fact, I think we're all aware that the power distribution in the world among states is gradually changing. Now, historically and unfortunately, major shifts in power relationships in the world has not been possible, or have not been possible without wars. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of having wars without bringing an end to the world at this particular time. So we have to do it more intelligently than in the past. But before doing that, we have to study the security manifestations of the trade wars. And for that, we have an excellent expert in the person of Bobo Lo. So Bobo, tell us about the security implications of trade wars.
Thank you very much, Ilse. I'm going to speak today about the relationship of trade wars to broader questions of international security and global order. And picking up on a theme that Ilse and previously Yukon have mentioned, trade wars are never just about trade. In fact, they're rarely about trade. They reflect much deeper conflicts in politics, in security, strategic culture, civilization. And as such, they are much more a symptom than a cause of the wider problems that we're seeing in the world today. I think today's trade wars, again, Yukon alluded to this, really point to the steady disintegration of the US-led liberal order. But in my view, they also highlight a much broader crisis, which is the crisis of the very concept of an international rules-based system. Because for all the talk that we hear about a multipolar world or a polycentric system of international relations, there is very little clarity on what might replace a US-led liberal order. The fact is, the world is in limbo. Many old truths are no longer sustainable, but they haven't given way to new truths, but rather new uncertainties. We are witnessing today a de-universalization of norms and values, and we are seeing in its place the emergence of a new world disorder in which power and the right to exercise it freely have become the paramount virtues. Now, the liberal historian Lord Acton spoke in the 19th century about power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think you could almost adapt Descartes' famous maxim, what seems to guide world leaders today: I can, therefore I will. And the very notion of global governance has become something of an oxymoron. We have long-standing institutions, the United Nations, the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization. They are struggling, all of them, to remain relevant. And yet there is no sign that newer international bodies, such as the BRICS, the G20, the AIIB, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there's no sign that these new organizations are capable of filling the vacuum. And really, this highlights a much more fundamental problem, is that international institutions are only as good as their member states. And as long as the great powers continue to see the world in exceptionalist terms, there is little hope that any kind of multilateralism can be made to work. The erosion of international norms has greatly increased the risks not only to global free trade, but to world order and security. And I would argue that the likelihood of military conflict has increased substantially, and the possibility of a major war, which we've long discounted, has actually become much more conceivable. And I think several aspects of today's trade wars are especially troubling to me. And I'll identify them quickly. The first is the return of the security dilemma. In an atmosphere of plummeting trust, proliferating crises, the natural instinct of many international leaders is to view world politics in zero-sum terms. It's kind of a race to the bottom. And this increases the possibility of accidents arising from miscalculation and overconfidence. I think we're seeing a crisis of leadership across the globe that is as acute as any since the 1930s. All politicians naturally seek power, but few are interested, let alone capable, of exercising power in the service of national, let alone international goals. They seek refuge in catchy slogans, "Make America Great," "Take back control," and so-called simple solutions. And many of these leaders resort to tactical opportunism at the expense of longer-term strategic thinking. And this has had the inevitable effect of encouraging xenophobic nationalism, rampant political cynicism, and of course, widespread popular disillusionment. We're seeing today also the triumph of moral relativism. In the so-called post-truth world, anything goes. My truth, your truth, anyone's truth. Truth has become almost entirely subjective and given way instead to that great word, narratives. And we're also seeing a new ideological divide, not just a cultural or an economic divide, but a larger ideological divide. In place of the old schism between communism and capitalism, we are seeing a fundamental conflict between conservative, popular nationalism on the one hand and liberal internationalism on the other. And I'll finish here with a paradox, which is that there is a growing disconnect between the reality of a world that is ever more globalized, not just in trade, but in the environment, technology, information, and the shimmer, the illusion that there are national solutions to national problems. And it seems to me that in these circumstances, there's very little prospect of the kind of international cooperation that we desperately need to address universal challenges such as climate change or the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So how do we pull back from the brink? Where do we go from here? Well, I would say the first thing is to recognize that we've been wrong, that we should get rid of our illusions. And we need to recognize that even in the most optimistic scenario, problem solving in international relations, in trade, security, and addressing problems such as climate change, this will be a long, bitter struggle, extremely difficult, and with plenty of setbacks on the way. We need to recognize that past assumptions about the naturalness of an international system, a cohesive international system with associated norms and institutions, these assumptions are no longer warranted. We need to accept that US political, economic, and moral leadership in the world is over. And this is true regardless of whether Donald Trump is re-elected in 2020. We are moving into a post-American era in global politics. But the only real question for me is what form will this post-American world take? And so, in the light of these uncertainties, there are a couple of pieces of advice that I would offer, if I may. One is the vital importance of retaining strategic flexibility. Well, what does this mean? This means diversifying bilateral partnerships. This means allowing oneself and others room for maneuver. And it also means participating in as many regional and global multilateral institutions as possible. Some of them won't work, of course, but it's important to at least participate, to be a player. And finally, and I would say this is the most important lesson of all, is that all countries need to be much more self-critical. They need to take a hard look at themselves rather than take the easy option of blaming others. Because ultimately, success will come to those who are most able and willing to address their own weaknesses and to move beyond short-term expediency and a narrow view of national interest and embrace internationalism and enlightened self-interest. Thank you.
Bobo, thank you very much. I think we have now completed a round discussion of the process of trade wars, which we have come to realize and recognize as not being exclusively trade wars, but part of a process of changing world power distribution, changing world productive processes, changing technologies, etc. So the discussion has been very enlightening. I'd like to ask the panelists if they have anything to add at this particular time. We've had a rather full discussion. Then may I say that I would take pride in the fact that we have essentially concluded our discussion in the allotted time possible, which often in these meetings is considered to be an achievement. So, may I take this opportunity on behalf of the audience, I think I can do that, to thank you for a very enriching discussion. It certainly sets the stage for the continuing discussions in other panels. And I think maybe the organizers would want to make an announcement. Do they have an announcement about lunch or anything? Yeah, well, why don't you maybe make the announcement, and then we'll get the sort of
Our
items of
esteemed
recognition.
panelists and speakers, we would like to present the honor awards for you. And I would like to invite Dr. Talal Abu Ghazali, the honorary chair of the ICP, to present the honor awards. Welcome. Please.
Before I do that, I would like to thank our distinguished moderator and the distinguished speakers for an excellent session. Indeed, I have learned a lot, and what we heard in this session is admirable. Knowledge, facts, and foresight. I just want to add a contribution. The only way to avoid a third world war is for the objective of the war to happen before the war. I claim that the objective of the war is for the two future superpowers, the US and China, to sit together and forge a new world order. So that we should call on the two superpowers to sit down and forge this future instead of taking us into a third world war to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.